Inga, and you're saying that the glacier is decreasing, that's affecting your livelihoods. We're hearing a lot of stories, not like that, but stories where people are saying climate change is beginning to affect our lives. It's very good to speak to you. Thanks for coming on, Inga, in Norway. Here's another message from Stephen in Ontario. In fact, before I read that, let me go to Sheetal, because we haven't spoken to her for a while, and she has all of the messages that you're sending in front of her. Sheetal, tell us what you've got.
I've got an email here, Ros, from Father Edilberto in Brazil, who says, how can a conscious person be optimistic about Copenhagen? Like Kyoto, it seems to me it will be a circus without good clowns. And Malcolm in Auckland says, the future of our civilization hangs on meetings like Copenhagen. Short-term interests drive the skeptics lobby, which is now resorting to desperate tactics to try and undermine due process. And a last email here from Nick in Ohio, who says, I don't believe Copenhagen will have an immediate impact on the world's climate. And given the strength of the global warming debunkers, it may not have enough influence to counteract these claims. Remember, you can get in touch too. Go to worldhaveyoursay.com.
Sheetal, thank you very much. Let's put that point straight to Prabir in Delhi. Some people are saying this is our last chance as the human race to make the right decisions, Prabir. And those same people are saying we don't believe those decisions are going to be taken. Are you as worried as they are?
You know, I'm really worried that we have time running out on us. But I wouldn't take a position that there is no hope, because I think as the things get worse, there are people coming onto the roads, to the streets, and there is a popular pressure building up. The key issue is, while we are willing to spend trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street and so on, the fat cats of the world, we really are not willing to save the global civilization as we know it. And this, to me, is really a failure of politics. It's not really a failure of the people or a failure of science.
See,
and I think this is where the people have to act. Sorry,
I think things will get worse. I think you're absolutely right, because we now have Canada, which is one of the G8 countries, which has just withdrawn from Kyoto. It's sitting on the second largest oil reserves in the world, and it's a particularly nasty, dirty reserve, apparently. They've just torn up all their agreements. They're going to be releasing these oil reserves into the markets, into the atmosphere, so it doesn't matter what we do. So unless you're going to tax them and actually punish them somehow for the profits that they make from this, they are going to have to cough up for the rest of the world. I think it's probably going to be a waste of time.
A couple of other big issues coming in on email, which we'll try and touch on briefly. This is a message from Everdeen in The Hague, who says, what about overpopulation? The climate hype is just about creating taxes and levies. And Daniel in Berlin, this is a point made time and time again by World Have Your Say listeners and viewers, that if you don't focus on population, the rest is irrelevant. Would you agree with that?
That's complete rubbish. Population isn't our problem. Our problem is that some people, and that's about a quarter of the world's population, are emitting too much. It's the Western world as well as the global middle class that is sucking the planet dry for its own model of wealth at the moment. But this has to change, but we're not going to get anywhere if we're going to have a dichotomy between these talks are going to deliver nothing and the expectation that Copenhagen is somehow going to be God and is going to solve all our problems. Copenhagen is key. A binding agreement is key that delivers money, that delivers real cuts. But Copenhagen is not the end of the story. The story continues over the next few years, and rapid action has to happen from the local level to the global level. But unless we get a global agreement, we will not get the kind of framework that the world needs to start now.
And what you're saying reminds me of one line in that editorial which was published in about 55 newspapers all around the world. They said, we can afford this match to go into extra time, we just can't afford a replay. Let's go back to Isaac in Nairobi. Isaac, do you think population should be further up the agenda?
I think I'm of the opinion that you cannot really compensate people after you've already damaged their economies, after you've already made them lose their climate and even their predictability of their crop harvest, particularly for developing countries. And I think the most important thing is also for us as a world to ask at the macro level, because the economies still have to develop. You look at the greed that China is coming to Africa to take over resources. Look at the emerging economies like China, like India, sorry. All of these, we need to ask ourselves at the macro level, can we actually have alternative sources of energy that can sustain economies? Because as long as we do not have solution to that, then most economies will actually pull out of Kyoto Protocol like Canada, And at the same time,
I'm
we not
just going
have
to come in,
solutions
Isaac, because the sound quality on your line has suddenly deteriorated, which is a shame. But your point was a clear one. You said focus on alternative energy rather than on population first and foremost.
Well, I mean, he was also making the point about China and Africa, and I think it would be a pity if we start to see Chinese companies acting like Shell or BP or Barracks or De Beers in Africa. I think that will be a very great pity. It's a bit like, you know, what have the Romans done for us? They've given us all this infrastructure, oil pipelines and so on. But of course, there's the oppression of colonialism, and I really hope that China does do something about that as well.
Now, before we finish, I must touch on this issue, because if you go online, it's certainly a big one. Everyone in Copenhagen may say the debate about the science behind climate change is closed. That's definitely not the case online. Stephen in Ontario says, I hope the Copenhagen conference is a failure politically, but successful in getting people to question the data. Meg, I know that you're convinced, but is anyone giving any room in this discussion for the people who aren't?
Look, science isn't decided on a sample size of one. In other words, to conclude that all of the peer-reviewed, careful science by thousands of scientists over the course of several decades is rendered null and void by one unfortunate incident is completely preposterous, quite frankly. What it does give us the opportunity to do is to bring into these talks the point that these discussions aren't anywhere near the science yet. Even were countries to get into the ranges, which they are now far below, of what has been suggested, that would put them on a path to reach 450 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, where science says we should be pushing for 350. So this is a good opportunity for us here in Copenhagen to talk about what the science is really telling us, and it is scary and it is stark.
But Daniel, in Berlin, you can't get away from the fact that, for whatever reasons, the scientists aren't making the case as convincingly as you might expect. There was a survey in the UK this weekend saying up to 50% of people are still not convinced. We see the evidence of that from our listeners to the World Have Your Say programme on the radio. How can the case be better made?
I think some of this is psychology. People are scared about the effects of climate change, and so they don't want to believe. Some of it is also because some of these skeptics are quite clever. They write well, they put their case well. And some of it is, frankly, because of you in the media, who always want to give two sides of the story. I sit in Berlin. If every Holocaust denier got as much airtime as the climate skeptics, my government would probably appeal to the Security Council of the United Nations, and rightly so, and say this is unacceptable, this is ridiculous. But somehow, climate skepticism, which is just as absurd and ridiculous and morally debunked as Holocaust denial, is coming up time and time again. The science is clear. If we don't act, we will have serious problems. And the point is, even if you don't believe the science, if you believe in an insurance policy, you should agree that we must act.
I'm going to interrupt you, Daniel, just because we're coming out to the end of the programme. I don't mean to be impolite. This issue of climate scepticism, I suspect, is not going to go away. We'll pick it up on another